Op 18 oktober 2019 vond er in New York een event plaats, genaamd Event201. Het was een simulatie voor een eventuele pandemie die zou gaan uitbreken. Het was het WEF. Met Bill en Melinda Gates Foundation. Het was een simulatie. Een eventuele oefening voor hoe te handelen bij een pandemie. 2 maanden later was het coronavirus er. De eerste 11 minuten van deze video gaan over Event201. Er zijn opnames van gemaakt door het WEF. Vervolgens zie je een video, een clipje van een eventuele cyberattack. En daarna volgt een half uur een opname uit Davos door het WEF, waarin ze bespreken wat te doen bij een eventuele cyberaanval, waarin alles uitvalt, alle stroom, alle elektriciteit. En ook hoe Klaus Schwab daarop reageert. Dat een stroomuitval grotere impact kan hebben op de mensheid dan een virus. Het zijn 2 soorten virussen. De een in de mens en de ander buiten de mens. Ik vind het interessant om dit met jullie te delen. Want een gewaarschuwd mens telt voor 2. Dankjewel.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
We have known about caps-like viruses in animals and people for decades, but have not been successful at developing a licensed vaccine. And sure, there are new technologies that may help, but it's going to be difficult. I am not optimistic about having a vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic.
So the policy crisis in question for this board in this meeting is this: how should governments, business, and international organizations allocate and distribute pandemic antivirals and medical supplies to the people who need them most?
What we've seen work very well in the HIV field is, in fact, procurement through the Global Fund. So having a centralized mechanism, so financially able to procure on behalf of affected countries would be critical. I think the second thing is it's going to be very important that for the business sector, for manufacturers of antivirals, that we have clarity around what the need is and where the need is and who are making the decisions.
I think that given that the countries most affected are those that are low and middle income countries with unequal access to technology, to finances, the UN has a worldwide footprint, universally recognized, and universal membership.
A global stockpile would certainly help ensure more rational and strategic allocation, but the reality is that we don't have the logistics capability, even within the UN, to bring that together in one place and run it. So this is where I think a collaboration between the international organizations like the World Health Organization and the private sector, which runs these supply chains for many purposes every day, understand where the supplies are, make smart decisions about how to allocate them to the people who need them in the places that need them the most, and then work with the industry to move those supplies from where they are today to where they need to be.
Just to underscore the point that cooperation among supply chain providers or businesses that have huge supply chains can add a lot of efficiency to the whole process.
The question is, can you, through this international mechanism, really promote commitments to doing this as quickly as possible and give people a sense that actually if they contribute more, that they will have a better chance of protecting their own populations and their country's security and health.
So to be completely clear, most of this production would already be committed in contracts.
Yes.
It is almost unheard of that people are producing product without having a forward commitment for the consumption of that product. So the first thing that needs to be done, because this is not something that the countries currently control, unless countries are going to bring about emergency situations and co-opt an existing supply chain.
I think it's not likely, I agree, that countries are not going to buy countermeasure to put into a global supply without retaining a large portion of it for themselves.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45%, and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
How should national leaders, businesses, and international organizations balance the risk of worsening disease that would be caused by the continued movement of people around the world against the risks of profound economic consequence of travel and trade bans?
If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder on the power of the UN. It's really important to get those industries and their trade associations and an efficient leadership established, which is decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
What is essential, what is non-essential travel, we have to clarify this. Otherwise, if we go down to 20% bookings over a long period, the company will run down. That's a fact.
You know, there's a whole complex set of issues in a highly interdependent world on supply chains that are just in time. We need to think about how much flex there is in that just-in-time supply chain system and make sure it keeps running. I think it's going to take specificity, and it's going to take knowledge that only the private sector has. The UN can play an important coordinating facilitation role, but the companies know where those commodities are, where they move, how to move them, and that's where a type of public-private collaboration that we have not generally had in these crises needs to be put together pretty quickly.
We are not out of money, yet. But the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is, how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government can supply some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Hotels will be experiencing, crippling losses doing that. And we know that the hotel business in itself makes up 5% of the GDP.
governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
We shouldn't underestimate the power of entrepreneurship. We need to escalate that, whether it's through the government's helping with tax breaks or subsidies of that nature to increase manufacturing of those types of products. It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
I think it's very important that we make sure that there is concise communication with all healthcare facilities where these patients are being treated so that there isn't mass panic.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
I personally do not believe that trying to shut things down in terms of information is either practical or desirable. And we do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy, second of which is relying and informing and equipping trusted sources of information with the facts so they can then pass that on. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad? Are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic that would have lessened the catastrophic consequences? We believe the answer is yes. So, are we, as a global community, now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare for the next pandemic?
The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken our economies and societies to the core and shown us how vulnerable we are to biological threats. In the digital world, similar risks are being overlooked right now. A cyber attack with COVID-like characteristics would spread faster and further than any biological virus. Its reproductive rate would be around 10 times greater than what we've experienced with the coronavirus. To give you an idea, one of the fastest worms in history, the 2003 Slammer sapphire worm, doubled in size approximately every 8.5 seconds, infecting over 75,000 devices in 10 minutes and almost 11 million devices in 24 hours. Fortunately, at least until now, cyber attacks have not impacted our health the way pandemics have, but the economic damages, and therefore the impact they have had on our daily lives, have been equal and sometimes even greater. You see, the only way to stop the exponential propagation of a COVID-like cyber threat is to fully disconnect the millions of vulnerable devices from one another and from the internet. All of this in a matter of days. A single day without the internet would cost our economies more than $50 billion, and that's before considering the economic and societal damages should these devices be linked to essential services such as transport or healthcare. As the digital realm increasingly merges with our physical world, the ripple effects of cyber attacks on our safety just keep on expanding at a faster pace than what we're preparing for. COVID-19 was known as an anticipated risk. So is the digital equivalent. Let's be better prepared for that one. The time is now.
A very warm welcome to everyone to this special on averting a cyber pandemic. This is the fourth day of the Davos Virtual Week. During this session, we will discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically increased the dependence of economies and societies on digital technology, increased the vulnerabilities of individuals, businesses, and governments. And the goal is to examine the lessons of this pandemic and identify steps to prepare for a better future global response to cyber attacks. To kick off our session, we will play a brief video on a potential cyber pandemic.
The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken our economies and societies to the core and shown us how vulnerable we are to biological threats. In the digital world, similar risks are being overlooked right now. A cyber attack with COVID-like characteristics would spread faster and further than any biological virus. Its reproductive rate would be around 10 times greater than what we've experienced with the coronavirus. To give you an idea, one of the fastest worms in history, the 2003 Slammer sapphire worm, doubled in size approximately every 8.5 seconds, infecting over 75,000 devices in 10 minutes and almost 11 million devices in 24 hours. Fortunately, at least until now, cyber attacks have not impacted our health the way pandemics have, but the economic damages, and therefore the impact they have had on our daily lives, have been equal and sometimes even greater. You see, the only way to stop the exponential propagation of a COVID-like cyber threat is to fully disconnect the millions of vulnerable devices from one another and from the internet. All of this in a matter of days. A single day without the internet would cost our economies more than $50 billion, and that's before considering the economic and societal damages should these devices be linked to essential services such as transport or healthcare. As the digital realm increasingly merges with our physical world, the ripple effects of cyber attacks on our safety just keep on expanding at a faster pace than what we're preparing for. COVID-19 was known as an anticipated risk. So is the digital equivalent. Let's be better prepared for that one. The time is now.
A great video to set the stage for our discussion this afternoon. I would like to introduce our excellent panel. We have David Koh, Commissioner of Cybersecurity and Chief Executive Officer, Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. As a commissioner, he has the legal authority to investigate cyber threats and incidents and to ensure essential services are not disrupted in the event of a cyber attack. We have Michelle Price, Chief Executive Officer, AusCyber from Australia. AusCyber was established in 2017 as part of the Australian government's Industry Growth Centres initiative. Welcome, Michelle. We have Klaus Schwab, the Chief Executive Officer, Checkpoint Software Technologies, a cybersecurity company headquartered in Israel. Mr. Schwab is also an inventor and holder of industry patent for stateful inspection technology. And finally, we have Clara Saab, Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, and a member of the Forum's Global Shapers Hub in Washington, D.C. She is dialing in from Taiwan. In her previous roles, she's been a senior advisor for emerging technology at the U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Countering Foreign Influence Task Force and U.S. Interagency Countering Violent Extremism Task Force. A great panel. Welcome to all of you. This public panel discussion will last for 30 minutes and will be followed by a more detailed discussion that is limited to forum members and partners. I will quickly move to the discussion now. As a broad question to all of you to think about, let me first pose the query, that what is cyber pandemic for you? From your own perspective, what does it mean? How similar is it to a viral pandemic? How different it is to what we've experienced over the last year? And importantly, what could we do about it if it was to emerge in our midst? Specifically, let me first turn to David. David, after observing the last year's response to the pandemic, how did that change your work and your thinking in protecting a nation, especially its critical infrastructure? What are the kind of policies do you think are required for the future? And will policies keep pace with evolution of technologies, or will we always be playing catch up?
Thank you, Samir, and WEF for inviting me to speak at this session of Emerging Cyber Pandemic, and for that great video. COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digitalization dramatically. Technology has done wonders to keep us connected. This panel is a great example of that. It's also a product, it's also aided our work and how we entertain ourselves. Additionally, during the lockdown periods, the digital space is an enabler for all sorts of activities. For instance, we see remote working, e-commerce becoming a new way of life. All of this have increased our reliance on digital infrastructure at an unprecedented scale. And it's also expanded our view on what essential services should consist of. I don't think many of us thought supermarket delivery or food delivery services were essential until we had a lockdown. The operating landscape has evolved. The digital domain and cyberspace have now become the lifeblood of our economic and social lives. The attack surface has also increased exponentially. Our policies, therefore, have to change in order to keep in tandem with these developments. The pandemic is an issue that plagues the physical world, but the cyber pandemic is a crisis in the digital world. I see some similarities in the approaches that we can take to manage these two types of pandemics. Well, first, in both situations, there is a need for collective responsibility. In dealing with cyber threats, different segments of the community need to work together to engender an environment of security and trust in the digital domain, so that we can optimize the full potential of the digital economy and society. So, for instance, governments can contribute by putting in place national strategies and initiatives to increase the broad level of cyber hygiene for all internet users. To this end, in Singapore, we have launched a safer cyberspace master plan last year with the aim of going beyond protecting just the critical information infrastructure and provide some basic level of cybersecurity for the whole of society. Beyond governments doing their part, there's also a role for industry partners, as well as enterprise and individual end users to play. We encourage industry partners to prioritize their customers' interests. Example, through secure by design practices in the provision of digital products and services. Enterprise and individual end users also need to have basic awareness of the types of cyber risks that are out there and the measures that they need to take to better protect themselves. It's not just a technical issue. End user awareness is also essential. Second,
David, complete your point.
Hyperconnectivity in the digital and physical realms also pose challenges to dealing with cyber and public health pandemics, respectively. So this requires close cooperation between various stakeholders to deal with the pandemic. In the case of cyber, the level of interdependence between organizations through the supply chains mean that compromise of a single supplier will generate ripple effects. The recent SolarWinds cyber breach is an example. So even an organization with good defenses can be vulnerable when threats come from third-party vendors. So given the challenges of hyperconnectivity, we need to work together. And it's, of course, cross-boundary, international, etc. Third, the threat that we have to deal with in cyber and the public health pandemic is rapidly evolving. So our responses need to be agile to keep in step with the changing nature of the threat. We hear about new variants in COVID virus. Similar in cyber, there are constantly evolving threats and sophisticated threat actors. So we need to have mindset shifts. We need to engender a shift, for example, from compliance to risk assessments. If you just have a rigid compliance mindset, it won't work when the threats are evolving. Enterprise security postures need to be constantly reviewed and updated. So one example is to move to a mindset of a zero trust cybersecurity model. Two key principles to this. Don't trust any activity in the network without verification. And secondly, we need to monitor for suspicious activities. So in sum, averting the cyber pandemic requires collective responsibility, close cooperation between stakeholders, and forward-looking mindsets. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Sorry, I interrupted you. Let me also quickly reach out to all who have joined us this afternoon. If you have queries, please post them on the chat box and we will bring them into the conversation. Let me go to Michelle Price and actually use David's idea of collaboration and kind of rephrase it for you. Australia recently announced the Quad Tech Network, where several countries will collaborate to build a cross-border cybersecurity ecosystem, hopefully. What benefits are you expecting this collaboration to bring? And how are you managing to work across borders on sensitive technologies?
Thanks, Sue. Such a great question. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Down Under as you traverse the accents that we've got on this fantastic panel this morning, this evening, wherever you happen to be. And a big shout out to Vikram Sharma from Quintessence Labs, who I know has joined us from Australia as well, a quantum encryption company that is part of AusCyber's portfolio. So the Quad Tech Network, a really big announcement that was made in this part of the world at the end of last year by the Australian government. And what it actually is, if you haven't had the chance, colleagues, to learn more about it, it's a network between Australia, the United States, India and Japan to focus on collaboration around research and think tanks to be able to have, I guess, an arm's length conversation from governments about some of the very sensitive issues that we're all dealing with as we try and sort of come to terms with the role of cybersecurity in critical technologies. But of course, the common language around what critical technologies means to us all is something that's still very rapidly evolving. And when we bring the sort of very important role of cyber as the enabler across critical technologies, not just in terms of being able to ensure trust, but also increasingly to help assure availability in all of these technologies, I think where we're sort of focusing on now is the very important aspect of how we need to build different kinds of collaborations around these issues. All of us would know if we're working in the day-to-day of cybersecurity, which most, if not all on this session would be doing, sharing sensitive information, in particular sensitive information around the development of new technologies that we have a sense will become critical technologies, especially when they can provide strategic advantage, not just economic advantage. It's incredibly hard to trust not just who we're sharing that information with, but how we're sharing it. So we all know those kinds of elements. And so this Quad Tech Network is really about saying we need to have some different ways of collaboration, as David referred to before, and that it's not just up to governments. And it's not just up to the private sectors to work with each other either. Of course, we know that public-private partnerships are critical to successful collaboration in cybersecurity and beyond. But one of the really important aspects from a policy point of view that often gets overlooked in the sort of broader collaboration sense is that role of think tanks in particular. And I'm really pleased to see that we are having a role specifically identified for think tanks. And I know that Clara will talk more to this as well. And I think what's really important from a collaboration point of view to the question, the second part of the question as well, is this notion of trusted markets. And so what we've been looking at AusCyber from the sort of position of being able to generate industry around cybersecurity and the concurrency that cybersecurity has across economies is this notion of trusted markets. If we really do want to take a secure by design approach, not just in how we might uplift legacy systems, how we might deal with the complexities of today, but how we also use the blank sheet of paper that is available to us with emerging technologies as they become critical technologies to take that secure by design approach. The humans involved need to have some kind of assurance around how we do trust those technologies. And so trusted markets is something that is becoming increasingly common in discussions in Australia, in this part of the world. And of course, we know it's a big feature of Five Eyes conversations as well. But really, it's not, again, just limited to policy. It's how we implement the norms of business against the norms of policy making that help us understand how a trusted market might be something that we can use not just in a supply chain way, but in a value chain way, to be able to get our heads around how we can better collaborate. Because I would contend that, of course, to the points that David was making, as I close my remarks, I'll throw it out there. I think we are living a cyber pandemic right now. I genuinely do believe that. Just because we don't see the same kinds of kinetic impacts that we've been seeing over the past 200 odd years of our lived experience around health-related pandemics, the massive increase that we saw of attacks happening and who they were being leveraged at over the past, or aimed at over the past 12 months. In Australia is one example, and I know that this is happening across most economies in the world. We've seen for the first time en masse the targeting to small and micro businesses, and not just to leverage their infrastructure to be able to pass through to get to a bigger destination. Those businesses are the targets. And so when we look at that in the fabric of that context of what the video gave us at the beginning of the session, I would suggest we're actually living a cyber pandemic right now. So I'd love to talk about that a bit more. I do throw that out to be slightly controversial because not everyone believes that that's what's happening. When we look at the economics of it, when we look at the impacts on everyday lives, I believe we are. Thanks, Sabine.
So let me take that to Gil straight away. Gil, we are in the middle of a cyber pandemic, but let me ask you, how did the other pandemic impact your business? How did it impact your customers' business? How did it change your threat assessments, your threat landscape? And are your clients behaving differently today?
First, thank you everyone for this opportunity. Thank you, Samir. I think that we are in, I don't know if I would call it a cyber pandemic because it doesn't stop our life like the biological pandemic that we are, but we're definitely under massive attack every day from multiple sources, from commercial sources, from criminal sources, from other governments that are trying to poke into our infrastructure. And that's a daily situation that we are in. On one hand, we are seeing that these attacks are quite successful. On the other hand, we are fighting them and it doesn't stop the entire economy at that moment. But what we know is that that can happen. That can turn into a cyber pandemic like the biological pandemic that we are facing right now. And I think you had an excellent movie explaining that at the beginning, so I don't need to go from the principles. Maybe the one thing I can add to that is that the dealing with it will be very, very different. I mean, if in the dealing with biological pandemic, we have human beings and we have a health system. We're dealing with other types of attack. We have police and we have defense forces that are human and that can react to human. In a cyber pandemic, we need to talk about computers defending against other computers. And we don't always have that infrastructure because we don't have the time and we don't have the people to deal with it. I mean, the scope of a cyber pandemic, the speed is something that human being cannot react to. So I think our focus should be on building the infrastructure that will protect us in real time, that we can adapt in real time. We call it, by the way, the 5th generation of attacks. Most organizations, and for all the listeners here, it's very likely that your organization is using today what we call Gen 3 technology to protect itself. That's usually not enough because we're in the middle of a Gen 5 storm of attacks, and the latest attacks that we've seen are all 5th generation, very sophisticated, polymorphic, very hard to detect. Think about the coronavirus that we are seeing now, but that every attack is a new mutation. Not every few weeks there's a new mutation, but every single attack is different. Looks different, even though it's using the same similar mechanism. So we are dealing with attacks that are like that. And I think what we're building, I don't want to be self-promoting, but what the world still doesn't use and still doesn't have is the infrastructure to protect itself in real time. So when we actually see something, we can not just detect it. Most of the world today knows how to detect certain types of attacks, but we actually prevent the attack from the zero attempt. And we scale that knowledge to everyone around the world so we can effectively block attacks on every scale. If it's a small attack, big attack on one nation, on the entire world, that's the infrastructure that we need, and that's what we are trying to build right now.
Gil made an important observation that we are playing catch up when it comes to technologies to respond to attacks invented through technological means. And I think that's an important point, and I'll come to that a bit later. But Clara, how do you visualize a cyber pandemic unfolding? Are you also of the opinion that we are in the middle of one? But what we have also seen is for sure an infodemic unfolding. Fake news, post-truth world, misinformation, synthetic data. How can private sector, government, and communities collaborate to respond to these multiple challenges that today we are confronting?
First off, it's such a pleasure to be here and speak with such an esteemed set of panelists. I definitely want to zone in on the info pandemic, which is a whole nother issue very much tied to cyber. I will start with, very U.S. perspective because that's where I'm from. Today, more than 75% of Americans are online with more and more personal information and data uploaded per minute to the cloud. The U.S. has also had a significant supply chain problem with the COVID-19 pandemic and such. Most people are working from home. I know in Asia that there's a lot more people actually going back to offices, but today in the U.S., most people, even large companies, are working from home using insecure networks that they share, Wi-Fi networks they share with the rest of their family. And a lot of companies, especially smaller businesses, are not adequately prepared. I think one of the biggest similarities between the physical pandemic and the virtual one is it attacks the most vulnerable groups in any society. You see seniors, the most vulnerable, being most susceptible to fake news online, clicking on clickbait content, and often falling for scams that create huge vulnerabilities in their IT systems. The same goes for their vulnerabilities to the COVID pandemic. And so I think we have to think about, vulnerable groups in similar ways as well. But to touch upon what others have already said, supply chain is really the core, I think, of 2021 and this year. Is really how do we think about the cyber pandemic in a supply chain lens? And when we think about supply chain, the one thing that I don't think other panelists have covered is really the talent gap. So I'm a disinformation researcher, and I actually joined U.S. government through a program at the White House that brings top entrepreneurs and technologists to do a term of service. And I have a lot of friends in Silicon Valley. Today, only 3% of federal tech workers in the U.S. are under the age of 30, with around 50% of the federal workforce actually going into retirement soon. And in 2019, I worked with the first director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency, Chris Krebs, to stand up the agency, where we saw a huge gap in talent that was there to have a workforce that was ready. And without a talent pool ready, it's very impossible to resolve any kind of major cyber issue. And it was very shocking to me going into US government to see the amount of vulnerabilities, the lack of training, the lack of ability for a lot of federal workers to really understand how to use IT in a safe and secure way. And we are as strong as our weakest link, right? So private-public partnership is so important. And more important now than ever, especially thinking about how do we do that for federal workers. And that extends to every single country where a lot of the federal workforce is seniors and older populations that are using the same IT systems that we are. The same extends to businesses today that have never been online, that are most hurt. They're small businesses that are trying to do food delivery online, and they're trying to use IT systems for the first time. And they are also especially vulnerable. To expand upon the content and infodemic side, it's propelled the pandemic significantly. You can imagine COVID misinformation and figuring out whether you should or should not wear masks, and disinformation spreading about conspiracy theories around mask wearing. Those are examples of where it can actually exaggerate a physical pandemic. What's been really interesting to actually watch the last few years is around this topic of the info pandemic. There's a new breed of career technologists coming out called open source researchers. They've been around for a long time, but we've seen a lot of these open source researchers, especially in think tanks and in places like the Digital Forensic Research Lab, being able to identify different kinds of info campaigns that state-backed actors are acting upon, and playing a critical role working with major cybersecurity companies, major social media companies, and are also working with governments. And I think seeing that explosion of so many great people that want to play a role in really ensuring the cyber hygiene of the internet is so wonderful and heartwarming for me. One of the things that was also especially challenging in the U.S. was, one sub-example is really around election security, which I think paints a lot of picture about a cyber pandemic these days, where you not only had something that we now deem a critical infrastructure announced, but you had some vulnerabilities around physical security and disinformation around whether physical systems were secure. In 2015, the Ukraine power grid was hacked, and imagine the kinds of supply chain consequences that happened, and that's something that happened in 2018, 2020 was a lot of people online having distrust in physical systems, even if it was secure. That info pandemic, that disinformation has had huge impact in the ability of everyday people to trust a system that is secure. And I think this is going to be the biggest challenge ahead, is really thinking about how to resolve that.
Thank you, Clara. I'm going to ask a question to all of you to wrap up this public session. If someone has a question to ask from the viewers, please do type it and I'll try to bring it in. But my question to all of you, I felt that there was a degree of optimism on the world being able to respond to a cyber pandemic. If you were to take a lesson from the last 1 year, we sucked. We did very badly in responding to the gravest challenge we have faced. We did not work together. We could not get the governments to move in time. We could not share information. We could not collaborate and share resources. How are you going to work in a live situation? What could be the new ideas of responding to a faster moving challenge that the cyber pandemic is likely to be? I'm going to give you all 30 seconds, starting with David. David, 30 seconds.
I think that's a great question. Well, it's half full, half empty. I'll share the experience that we have from
30 seconds, only 30 seconds.
Right. So in ASEAN, we have managed to get the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 countries, different degrees of economic development to work together. So recently at the ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting, they've agreed that cyber is a key enabler for the digital future. And we have agreed to set up a CERT, ASEAN CERT information sharing mechanism. So this is a small step, but it just shows you that even countries as disparate as the 10 countries in the Association of Southeast Asians can come together, recognize that this is a common threat, and work together. I think that's hope.
Michelle?
Public-private partnership, it just has to be part of the solution here. And building off what David just said, I think that we also need to remember that there is a huge amount of talent, to use Clara's word there, sitting in small businesses. They are so close to the coalface on all of these issues. We need to be listening to them a lot more, and we have the mechanisms to be able to do that. And I'm hopeful that as part of the kinds of forums that David just described and the Quad Tech Network and beyond, we've got a lot of this knowledge infrastructure now to be able to leverage those voices as well.
Michelle, quick question to you. Do you believe citizens trust enterprises enough to have to create the framework for the response you're suggesting?
I think citizens of the world are going to be increasingly moving with their fingers, not with their feet so much anymore, thanks to the pandemic. I don't think that necessarily trust is being viewed in the same way that it was once upon a time. And I think we need to really examine what our definitions are around these things and have an open conversation about what trust really truly means in a digital world, because we keep assigning the same definitions from the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s to the current world that we're in. It's so different. So I do think that there is enough trust in the ways in which technology are being applied. There's just probably not enough trust in the way that they're being developed and the way that governments withhold information around how technology is developed. And then, of course, the regulatory process is also something that undermines citizen trust. But I think because there is a lot of use in the application of technology, we need to leverage that and leverage the psychology behind that.
So your short answer is that we don't know yet. Deal.
We don't know yet, no, but I think that there is enough of a groundswell.
Dale, 30 seconds to you.
I think first, the good news is over the last year, our dependence on the internet, on cyber, was huge. And the internet and cyber withstood that. And we've seen amazing attacks, we've seen huge attacks, and we survived. Are we ready for the future? Not quite yet. I think we can do much better. I think we need to build much faster infrastructure. I think it's not just about collaboration between organizations, and there is good collaboration. I mean, we cooperate with other countries, we cooperate with other companies, we cooperate with our competitors. This forum of the World Economic Forum, the Cyber Forum, is active throughout the year and is helping. So I think the answer is that we need to do much more, and we should be proud of what we've achieved last year, because the world moved to the internet and the internet survived. And the internet.
Dear Hermann Graf, Your Excellency, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, dear participants, it's such a privilege to address you all at a time when we so much rely on digital infrastructure and, of course, its underpinning cybersecurity. I wish to thank in particular my good friend and committed partner at the World Economic Forum, Mr. Hermann Graf, the CEO and Chairman of the Executive Board at Sberbank, and of course also a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. The Forum has built an excellent relationship with the Russian Federation, both with the business community as well as with the government. I was pleased to meet with President Putin last year, and I look forward to deepening this relationship with you, Mr. Prime Minister, and your government. 2020, the year that has really changed the world. It is thanks to technology that we are able to join the cyber polygon entirely remotely, for the first time actually since World War II. The coronavirus pandemic marks a fundamental inflection point in our global course. While it is still early to assess the total impact of this pandemic, it is already visible that it has a catalyzing effect. The crisis has exposed the inconsistencies and inadequacies of multiple systems, our health system, to a certain extent our economy, our employment, and our educational systems. It has shed light to structural shortcomings that had never been properly addressed before and which impede social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Our existing fragmented global architecture is not fit anymore for purpose in the 21st century. It's high time for a great reset. Change is not happening. We have a choice to stay passive and see the negative trends unravel: inequality, polarization, nationalism, racism. If we do not stop those trends, will lead to a post-corona world that definitively is less sustainable, less equal, and much more fragile. On the other hand, we can instead use our time to reimagine our world and build a new social contract. We need a great reset that will shape a much more resilient system for the post-corona era. We have to mobilize all constituents. First, to foster economic growth, which creates fairer markets, fairer outcomes. Second, we have to invest in advancing our shared goals, such as equality, protecting the sustainability of our shared natural resources, our global commons. Third, we have to utilize the innovation of the fourth industrial revolution to provide us really with better lives. Technology and cybersecurity are of crucial importance in this COVID era. One of the most striking and exciting transformations caused by the pandemic has been our transition to the digital of everything, both in our professional but also in our personal lives. It has come in a very short time, and technology has been central to the way we have collectively managed also the COVID-19 crisis. It still allowed us to interact on a personal basis. It still allowed us to a certain extent to maintain our business activities. But key was always the infrastructure which made possible the delivery of essential services, the continuation of business, and the maintenance also of social contacts, even in the most disruptive moments of the pandemic. Our reliance on digital services and infrastructure has exponentially increased due to the unprecedented connectivity which we have established now. From the adoption of large-scale working from home arrangements to the use of cloud services, e-commerce, e-health, e-education. Many tech leaders have noted that within a couple of months we achieved such advancements in digital transformation that would have taken otherwise 2, maybe 3, maybe even more years. This paradigm shift to digital has made the role of cybersecurity as a global public good even more pronounced. It serves as an enabler for business continuity and the silver thread for our connectivity. Yet, as businesses and organizations are putting great efforts to serve their customers, deliver essential services, and protect their employees amidst the pandemic, cyber criminals have also been quick to exploit the increased vulnerabilities and the increased use that came along. The World Economic Forum recently published the COVID-19 risks outlook. The third greatest concern for companies surveyed is the increase of cyber attacks. We all know, but still pay insufficient attention to the frightening scenario of a comprehensive cyber attack, which would bring to a complete halt to the power supply, transportation, hospital services, our society as a whole. The COVID-19 crisis would be seen in this respect as a small disturbance in comparison to a major cyber attack. We have to ask ourselves in such a situation, how could we let this happen? Despite the fact we had all the information about the possibility and the seriousness of a risk attack. Cybercrime and global cooperation should be at the forefront of the global agenda. The grim reality is that cybercrime today is definitively a growth industry. It has significant financial costs to the global economy, but it has also important indirect costs. It can undermine the public confidence in digital transformation and therefore into the overall trustfulness of a society. There is no doubt that building digital trust and a secure internet for the global economy is one of the major challenges that no nation or company can solve alone. It requires a global response with strong private-public cooperation. In recognizing this need, the World Economic Forum launched in 2018 the Center for Cybersecurity to offer a global convening platform for governance, large corporations, and civil society to address the systemic cybersecurity challenges and find joint solutions. It is obvious that governments have to play a leading role in securing cybersecurity, but ultimately, cybersecurity is a challenge for all of us. It is important to use the COVID-19 crisis as a timely opportunity to reflect on the lessons the cybersecurity community can draw and improve our preparedness for a potential cyber pandemic. Since we are the first generation to have such levels of interconnectivity and global value chains, we need to take decisive action in preparing. I'm glad that Cyber Polygon is one of the great initiatives that address the need for building capabilities that enhance global cyber resilience and preparedness, fighting against cybercrime and cyber attacks. I'm particularly pleased to see the high number of leaders that join the Cyber Polygon this year. I trust you will have constructive dialogues and exercises on the most pressing challenges in securing our shared digital future. Our digital interdependence and interconnectivity in the COVID era makes the integrity of cyberspace an even more critical element of our collective future. I wish you every success. We all know, but still pay insufficient attention to the frightening scenario of a comprehensive cyber attack, which would bring to a complete halt to the power supply, transportation, hospital services, our society as a whole. The COVID-19 crisis would be seen in this respect as a small disturbance in comparison to a major cyber attack. To use the COVID-19 crisis as a timely opportunity to reflect on the lessons the cybersecurity community can draw and improve our preparedness for a potential cyber pandemic.